Well, thank you for staying with the Monday Report. Let's get into that conversation. We're calling it the war on graft. Has there been progress made? What more is left? At Trevor Mbidi at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Monday Report. You can also text us. Tell us your name and where you're texting from on 22422. That's our SMS line. Let me introduce my guest one more time, beginning from my farthest right, Sheikh Mohammed Sheikh, Director Dawa Jamia Mosque in Nairobi. Thank you so much for making time. Judith Chamala, Assistant Director, Asset Tracing at the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. Asante sana for making time. And Charles Kanjama, Senior Counsel. Thank you very much for making time. And Diana Gishengo, National Coordinator, TISA, which is the Institute of Social Accountability. Thank you very much for making time. So send in your views. We'll go through some of them during this broadcast. But I'll start with you, Shamala. I was looking at your report, the 2021-2022 report from EACC. Yes. Would you say that we are winning the war on corruption?
Thank you, Trevor, for having us here this evening to speak about the war on graft, where we are. Yes, I think we are winning to a very large extent. Just as I said, I think a month ago I was here, we informed Kenyans that we have now moved into new strategies when it comes to the war on corruption. Other than taking files to the Director of Public Prosecution, now we have moved to follow assets that have been illegally acquired. Not only are we using the court system, but now we are using the alternative dispute resolution, where we are now getting into negotiations with people who have acquired public assets illegally, and that is working. Just recently we saw property land in Mombasa that belongs to the Kenya Civil Aviation was recovered through the court process, and the Commissioner for Lands was actually personally fined 15 million shillings. We are waiting to see whether he'll pay or whether he'll go to the Court of Appeal, but that judgment has gone a long way. We, just over, I think last year, we saw land belonging to Meteorological Department coming back, worth 5.2 billion. They're using it to construct housing. Even the President mentioned that. So to a very great extent, other than just taking suspects to court and through the DPP, we have decided to go for those assets. It becomes better when you take the benefit away from the grabber. It becomes painful because the benefit is taken away. So I think we are making great strides.
Okay.
Yes.
Senior Counsel, would you say we are winning this war in your assessment?
Trevor, I would not say we are winning the war, because the war has a long way to go. The battle is still in the early stages. I think if you look at the institutions of government in the public sector, from the top, the Office of the President, the Cabinet, and the other agencies, the perception on corruption among Kenyans, when the Transparency International do their corruption perception index, there has not been any significant reduction. And there is a perception, even in the government of the day, that has come in from senior advisors of the government, that the fight against corruption is not their priority. I think this sends very worrisome signals and messages to various people in the public sector. And then, of course, you have the private sector, which also participates in corruption. And the work of Ethics Anti-Corruption Commission is mainly focused on the public sector. But there's also a lot of corruption involving private sector players. What I would say is that corruption remains a grave national vice. So much needs to be done. And I think even though there have been a number of steps, as Judith has pointed out, we are not where we expected to be. I don't think we are where we should be. The one area where I think there has been positive progress is in issues of attitudes. Most Kenyans understand that corruption is terrible, it's a vice, but we tend to externalize the vice of corruption. We deplore, we decry corruption when it is done by others. We excuse it when we are involved in it, whether passively or actively. We use words like extortion, and whether corruption is petty corruption or grand corruption or larceny, all of it corrupts the soul of the person, of the business, of the organization, and of the nation. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the soul of our nation is suffering to heal from this rot this rot that is encroaching into our limbs and organs of pervasive corruption. That is the reality of the country of which we are a part.
Okay. Gishengo, what is your assessment?
I do agree that the war is far from being won. Very, very far. We've won a few battles. One of them is that we enacted a law that was significantly comprehensive, and if it was adhered to, it would have helped us in tackling the problem of corruption. We also tried in our constitution to have an entire chapter on leadership and integrity so that the leadership of all our institutions, elective and appointed, people come with integrity, and for that reason, they should be keen to defend that particular profile that they come into office with. That's where it ends. Mm-hmm. Oh, and we have an institution in the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, DCI, as killing themselves to fight graft, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, and so on. When it comes to public attitude, for some reason, because of allowing corruption to go on, with very minimal effort of abating it, then it has become very, very normalized and to some extent admired. So you will find people questioning. Kanjama has called it excusing, but there are people, we defend people on certain lines because whatever benefit was for our community, was for our family. And for elected members who serve, say, one term, if they come back to their constituents and they are still paupers, they'll be asked, surely you did not get into the culture of accumulating wealth by all means.
So
most of it's expected. Mm-hmm. So it has become very, very normalized. You've seen interviews and a culture among the young people of getting rich no matter what. So we are saying if you can get alternative ways, surely we should all be living a good life. Mm-hmm. And for the current government to openly display that corruption is not one of the things we are very keen about. Okay, remember in the campaign period, they said this is not one of the areas. At best, we will allow institutions, but it is something that will require leadership at all levels. So that is one of the areas I think has weakened the war on graft. Yeah. And most recently, as you have indicated, now we want even to puncture the remaining safeguards that we have in the law and weaken it so that it's no longer functional.
Okay. We'll get into that in just a bit. But Sheikh, from your perspective as a religious leader, are we winning this war?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. To start with, I wish to agree with my colleagues here that we are not about to win the war because of several reasons. We have to have the will to win the war. And it is not what we say, what we intend, what we hope, but it is what we do that matters. And are we doing enough to combat or to face this evil in our society? The answer might be different to different people, but to my own perspective, I feel we are not doing enough. First and foremost, we are supposed to remember our objective on this life, our objective on this world. As Madam rightly said, that many people, they feel that they have to amass as much wealth as possible. But is that a reason as to why we exist? According to Quran, chapter number 28, verse 77, God says, وَابْتَغِ فِي مَا آتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةِ. Seek through that which Allah has given you the home of the hereafter. وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. And do not forget your share on this world. وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ. And do good just like God has done good to you. So up to that, there are three things that we have been reminded in that particular verse. That we are here on this world to prepare for our future, for our next world. And that is by first being, by doing the good and abstaining from the evil. And one of the evil that faces us as a community is corruption. Okay. And then God says, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. And don't forget your portion, your part on this world. Okay. So you are allowed, as you work for your next world, you do your best to live a good life. Okay. But that good life, as you struggle, as you do your best to earn what you intend to earn, you are supposed to think of the means that you use to earn that wealth. Okay. We are allowed to earn the wealth, but using a proper means. Okay. And we don't agree with the point or with the idea that normally people say that the end justify the means. Okay. So no matter how rich you want to be, or your objective is to become as rich as possible, regardless of the means that you lose. As far as we still have that notion, then we will never win this war. Okay.
Shamala, I wanted to start with the baseline of this conversation, because then we start dealing with perception versus reality. I was looking at your report, 2021-2022.
Yes, Trevor.
You've so far gotten assets, 33 assets, worth around 11 billion. That was just last year.
Yes.
You've also gotten 940 million back to the government. You've received 5,048 cases that have been reported to you.
Yes.
So are we really not winning this war, or is it just a matter of perception?
To some great extent, I should say that we are winning. We are winning. Why? The 5,000 cases that we receive, in fact, there are more. I think there are about 7,000 annually. They are not cases that relate to corruption and economic crimes alone. It's important for Kenyans to understand that. We even go deep where we even get marital issues, if I may say that on a light note, where someone will complain that their husband has just eaten all the money that they've received from KTDA. So what we do when we receive those reports, we sieve them. There are those that will go to the Commission of Administrative Justice, because we don't deal with that. There are those that we will forward to the DCI, and there are those that we will deal with if they are corruption and economic crime related. But if they are not, then we disseminate them to the respective institutions. So to a great extent, like I have explained, we've had to sit down and try and look at this war from a very different perspective. Are we just going to investigate matters and send them to the DPP, but let this person, the suspect or the grabber, lightly used, retain what they took from the Mwananchi? Because when you look at our Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act, when it comes to compensation of the victim, it is basically taking that benefit, returning it back, like we have said there. We return money to the consolidated fund, by the way, and we also return property to the institution that from which it was grabbed. But just going into the issue of the private sector, it's going to be very interesting to note, and when the Bribery Act was passed, it was actually a collaboration between the private sector and EACC. And there was a whole report that was sent to the president then. And out of that, we are actually charging companies, private sector, on bribery, on issues to do with bribery. When you look at the Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, it talks about the private sector. We actually deal with them from the prevention, from the arrest, and all those things. So we are not only dealing with corruption within the public sector, we're also dealing with it within the private sector. Now, interestingly, from my co-panelists, it's very interesting that they raised the issue of the war and perception about people. I think Kenyans need to know that this war is not about EACC alone. It's a stakeholder fight. Because just like Madam Sophie has said, if an MP goes back to the village after 5 years and you have not amassed wealth, who is going to ask this MP, ulikuwa unafanya nini? Is it not the citizen? So what are they doing? They're glorifying corruption. They are telling this gentleman, hey, what were you doing in office? Instead of actually coming out, asking for accountability of public funds, why are we glorifying corruption? When it comes to the faith-based institutions like churches, the mosques, I'm happy the Sheikh is here and he's reading the Quran. We have the same thing in the Bible, where corruption is actually, it's like condemned. When you are getting property through greed from the poor, because when you divert funds that are meant to build a hospital, for example, and you take your children to to a private school. What are you doing? Isn't that corruption? So we need to sit back as a country and ask ourselves, what part do I have to play to actually slay this dragon? What about professional bodies? We have the LSK, we have the engineers, we have the accountants. Do you know for a perfect, near perfect, there's no perfect, a near perfect case of corruption and economic crime, you will find a lawyer. I'm sorry to say I'm one of them. You will find an accountant, you will find a banker, and all those people professionals. What are the professionals' bodies doing? Do we just sit back and ask what is EACC is doing? Instead of asking ourselves, what role do I play to fight this war on this thing? Because it's not an EACC thing.
Okay.
Yes.
And Kanjama, we're talking about institutions of government here. Is that where we drop the ball? Because are there too many layers that then allow for loopholes for people to get away with crime? EACC, DCI, DPP, then the judiciary.
There is a certain favorite thinker. She died a few years back. She was a professor of law. She's called Deborah Road. And she wrote a book or an article on the title, Too Much Law, Too Little Justice. And I've always been fascinated by that, because the tendency of stakeholders in our legal justice system, when they hear that corruption is a problem, is to throw more law and more institutions at the problem, and then to list the number of institutions, to list the number of laws, and say we are fighting corruption. But sometimes you can throw more law and end up with less justice, or in this case, less outcomes of fighting corruption. We do know that part of the problem sometimes is conflict between institutions. I think one of the biggest problems, Trevor, in my view, is that there's a strong perception that the job of fighting corruption is the job of EACC, or the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. And EACC is merely a constitutional commission that is meant to support and champion the fight against corruption. But if you restrict the fight against corruption to EACC, if the police are not involved, if Office of the President and the Cabinet is not involved, if Parliament and the judiciary are not doing their bit, then it is a futile fight. If, as Judith has said, professional bodies, organizations don't think that they have any role to fight corruption, if the common man or woman, Wanjiku, the common person, doesn't think that it's part of their job to fight corruption, then whenever we talk about the fight against corruption, we'll get the statistics from EACC about how they are fighting corruption as an institution. But EACC is a very small institution in Kenya. You can't compare it, for example, with the police or the DPP, which are much bigger. So if the police is not fighting corruption, if the structure of the public service, which is driven by the cabinet, all the state corporations are assigned to various cabinet ministries, if that song of the fight against corruption has not been mainstreamed from the top, if there's no conviction from the top, then of course it's a futile fight. So allow me to say that there have been several significant and positive steps in the fight against corruption. It's not all doom and gloom. But for me, the biggest concern is the way we try to kind of like outsource the fight against corruption to one institution, that when you look at its budget compared to the budget of the entire government of Kenya, when we look at its contribution to GDP compared to the contribution of private sector and public sector, it's impossible. And so that has been part of our problem. The EACC is doing the best they can in very challenging environment. My feeling is that the rest of us are not playing our role. And of course, EACC also needs to do much more of education. So they have a department on education and kind of like getting the public to be sensitized about it. It's very key because prevention is better than cure. So they are fighting to cure the situations of corruption. but the battle to prevent corruption is still largely unfought and unwon.
Okay. And Gishengo, you spoke about public attitude, but what about institutional attitude? I mean, we've seen instances where the DPP withdraws cases that were already at the judiciary, that went through the whole system that Kanjame is talking about, but then also at the same time, the judiciary allowing the cases to be withdrawn. Nobody says, hold on, you got here for a reason, let's take this to the end. So is it that the institutions also don't see eye to eye, or are there too many points that are easily compromised before we get to the justice part of it?
It would be a combination of both. That one, there's something very wrong in how we have politicized the war or access to justice for victims of corruption. And we need to start calling it out as it is, because Kenyans are victims of a very heinous crime of corruption, in all forms and manner. But what happens is the institutions then take them up and decide this is our political carrot. In some instances, it's very possible that under our judicial processes, there were weaknesses and those matters ought to have been withdrawn. But increasingly, how most of the graft cases have been treated, and let me say, not just corruption cases, there are also integrity cases around impeachment. Impeachment of a deputy governor, impeachment of a cabinet secretary, impeachment of a governor, how Senate treats that particular matter, then you just see it is not about ensuring that Kenyans get justice. It is about political ping pong. When it gets to that, then our institutions get it very, very, very wrong. And most recently, unfortunately, when headlines are now all cases are being withdrawn, there are people who become hesitant, because the confidence that we must continue to build around our judicial and access to justice institution must consistently remain at a certain level. The minute there are 10 headlines, 11 cases were withdrawn by the ODPP around economic and anti-corruption crimes. What does that tell people? All the people who had taken their time to invest in investigating, in reporting, investigating, hoping that finally there will be a change. There are cases where we've had whistleblowers in this country. People who decided, I care so deeply about this country, I cannot allow this institution to go under because of the looting, the scheming that is continuing. Then all their efforts, their sacrifice is washed down the drain because of the technicalities. One, it could be the technicalities of our judicial institutions, and then the second one is political interference. That is something that as Kenyans we must try to guard to the best of our ability. Okay. And it hasn't started now. Yeah. 2012, 2013, and the history of ASECA is known, the Bribery Act, the Leadership and Integrity Act, and how much the aspirations that came out of Bomas, Naivasha, were watered down. When we expect that the clearing and vetting of political candidates will follow certain standards, then all of a sudden, leadership and integrity is beyond reasonable doubt. How? What standards are these that we are telling people you must have been convicted for your character to be in doubt? Okay. That becomes very, very problematic, and our institutions and it's mainly the leadership of the institution. Most of the technocrats work very hard to deliver on the mandate. Okay, Sheikh, I'll come to you in just a bit, but I'll have to take a quick break. When you come back, we'll also see some of your feedback. Use the hashtag Monday Report at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. What then must we do to win this war against corruption? That's the conversation we're having in just a bit, all right? Don't go too far.